It's a great pleasure to be with you, all of you here tonight to reflect on some of the amazing world events which we've seen unfolding over the past year. Events which speak of God's undeniable presence in our world and, more importantly for us, the imminent return of Christ. And before we jump into a review tonight, I'd like to start by taking a minute to consider just how significant the last few years have been. And in order to do that properly, we need to have some perspective. And the best perspective we can get is from Christ himself. Because it was Christ who knew that we would be living in the last days. We'd be living in anticipation of his coming. And with that in mind, he gifted us with a special letter, the book of Revelation. And as we know, in that letter, he provides us with a description of events and prophecies that have since unfolded in the world from the time of the first century ecclesia through to our time today. And it's this letter which predicts some of the world's most significant and historic events, from the rise and fall of the Roman empires through to the rise and fall of the Muslim and Turkish empires. And for those of us who have studied this book, we can see that history in full colour as it's described in Revelation. And retrospectively, we can look back and we can see not just the kingdoms of men as they come and go, but more importantly, we can receive reassurance and conviction that God is intimately involved in our world and our lives. And so of all the times that are described in Revelation over the last 2,000 years, though great and momentous they are, none of them are anywhere near as significant as the times in which we live today, as we sit on the verge of the return of Christ. And so while our brethren and sisters went about their lives over the last 2,000 years, and they could look to the events of the times in which they lived and place their finger on a time period in Revelation that was contemporary with their time and recognise God's hand at work in their lives, in their world, while our brothers and sisters could do that, none of them could put their finger on the part of the timeline in Revelation that is contemporary with the return of Christ. And yet we can. And brothers and sisters, that great honour and privilege falls to us. We are the ones who can open up Revelation chapter 16. We can point to verse 15 where it says, "Look, I come as a thief." And we can say, that's going to happen very, very soon, if not in our time. No other brother or sister who lived during the apocalyptic timeline could say that. And of course, they desperately wanted it. We know at certain points they were crying out to God, "How long, O Lord?" But they were never to see it in their time. And yet here we are. We're about to witness the return of the King of Kings. And are we crying out like those brethren and sisters were? Are we desperate for the return of Christ like they were? Or are we too comfortable to have a sense of desperation? And if we consider the cry of our former brethren and sisters when they called out to God, "How long, O Lord?" is that a state of mind which characterises the way that we live our lives today? Well, we began with Revelation because it provides the context or the perspective for what we're about to talk about this evening. And what we're really considering tonight is the work of the Elohim in the kingdom of men as it draws to an end. We're going to observe no less than the work of Christ as he directs his angels to work through nations and events to prepare for his imminent appearance. And so as we reflect over the last year, there have been some key geopolitical themes which have really stood out as being significant in relation to prophecy. Now, this year has been a year, as we've seen, of both growing conflicts and growing alliances. And we're going to have a bit of a look through that in more detail tonight. But at a high level, here are some of the geopolitical themes that we saw in 2019. So we saw growing conflict between Britain and the European Union. We saw growing conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. We saw growing conflict between Ethiopia, Sudan versus Egypt. We also saw growing ties and alliances between the Commonwealth nations, Israel and the Commonwealth nations, Israel and Sunni-oriented Arab states, Egypt and Saudi Arabia. We saw growing recognition of Israeli sovereignty by Commonwealth nations. So we saw them recognising, of course, Jerusalem. That was a little while ago. The US did that. We saw this year the Golan Heights and Judea and Samaria. And we also saw growing military and economic cooperation between Iran and Sudan and Libya and Russia. And all of these geopolitical themes have one thing in common. They all are pointing to the same thing in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11. See, the nations are inadvertently moving into the configuration described in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11. Now, that alone is very significant. 10 years ago, many of those alliances and conflicts weren't even happening, and let alone as overtly as what they are now. So let's take a bit of a closer look. The first and perhaps most obvious is that there is a growing tension between the belligerents of Ezekiel 38. And so the first case that we'll look at tonight is the flare-up that occurred this year between two relatively long-standing enemies, Iran and Saudi Arabia. Now, throughout history, the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran has been one of belligerence, mostly because they adhere to opposing variants of Islam. However, what has also caused contention between them is their relationship with Israel. Back in the 1960s, before the Iranian Revolution, Iran actually recognised Israel as a state. And it was, in fact, the Saudis who couldn't stand the fact that the Iranians supported Israel. Well, here we are in 2019, where completely the opposite is happening. The Saudis are now increasingly working with and supporting Israel, while Iran threatens to destroy Israel. And so it's incredible to consider that we have a situation where Ezekiel 38 is geopolitically becoming a reality, which in the case of the relationship between between Saudi Arabia and Iran was never the case. And so we saw tension between Saudi Arabia. We saw the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran seriously escalate in May this year, when two Saudi oil tankers were bombed and damaged. The incident took place near the United Arab Emirates port near the Strait of Hormuz, and Saudi Arabia confirmed that two Saudi oil tankers sustained significant damage. A few weeks later, there were more explosions on Saudi tankers in the Gulf. And as part of this, there was also an attempted attack against a Japanese oil tanker. So on the left-hand side, there are some of the tankers that were... on your left-hand side, there are some of the tankers that were bombed. And on the right-hand side is a picture apparently taken by the United States at night time of Iranian special forces trying to remove an unexploded limpet mine from the side of the Japanese oil tanker. So it was a bit of an awkward moment there for Iran, who of course denied their involvement. Well, months later, the Iranians escalated the fight even further, and they shot dozens of missiles into a Saudi oil plant, taking out 5% of the world's oil supply. The missiles were shot from within Iraq. They flew over southern Iraq through Kuwaiti airspace before hitting their targets. And we know that for a reason, because of course those who did it suggested otherwise. But one of the things that gave them away was that some of the Dud missiles actually fell short just north of their target. Well, very soon after, Reuters broke a story about how the US had responded to the Iranian attacks on Saudi Arabia by essentially hacking Iranian infrastructure, either by destroying or degrading it. And that infrastructure included communications infrastructure, which was used by the Iranians to spread propaganda, and also an Iranian oil plant. You may remember how Israel hacked an Iranian nuclear power plant and took control of it in 2019. Well, the US did a similar thing here, which wasn't particularly well known, and they did it in response to Iran's attack on Saudi Arabia by hitting the oil production facility with a cyber strike. And then following that, only last month, 2 Iranian oil tankers were hit by missiles. And the Iranian foreign minister responded by warning of an all-out war if the US or Saudi Arabia conducted military strikes against his country. And so this conflict isn't dying down anytime soon. And we'll most likely see more of this soon. But again, the point here is that you can see the groundwork for geopolitical tension in Ezekiel 38 being laid, not just between Israel and Russia, but between other members of the opposing coalitions of Ezekiel 38. Well, the second example of growing tension between Ezekiel 38 belligerents is the conflict between Egypt and Ethiopia. We know from Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38 that Russia, along with Libya, Sudan and Ethiopia, will invade Egypt. And this relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia has been deteriorating over the past few years because of a project which Ethiopia has to build a dam which will significantly slow the water supply into Egypt. The construction of this dam began in 2011 in northern Ethiopia, where 85% of the Nile's waters flow. The fear is that the pace at which Ethiopia wants to fill this dam is so fast that it will leave the downstream flow for Egypt significantly reduced, which would impact Egypt's economy significantly. Remember that Egypt's economy and agriculture essentially straddles and depends on the water that's coming from the Nile. You can see out there on the left, the green essentially. And so this is a really big issue for Egypt. And in fact, there's already been threats of war coming from Egypt within Egyptian circles as a means by which to intervene and resolve this to save their water supply. And interestingly, there's a prophecy in Isaiah 19 which talks about the Nile drying up directly after Russia has invaded. And it's possible that Russia, Ethiopia and Sudan will invade Egypt, as Daniel 11 and Ezekiel 38 describe. And then after this takes place, Ethiopia continues to build the dam, which then destroys the Nile and results in some of the devastation of Egypt's agricultural industry, as Isaiah 19 describes. So moving on from the Arab states and looking at Russia, we can see that this year their military presence has still been growing as well. You would remember that they annexed part of Ukraine a few years ago, which gave them direct access to Turkey. Well, this year they significantly stepped that up by starting to fortify Crimea. And so much of the advanced and heavy military hardware that is needed for this part of the world, that is being used in this part of the world, might seem confusing to some, but really it only makes sense when you consider that both Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11 describe the invading force moving like a storm in a whirlwind, and only established fortifications like that could really protect and offer such a launch pad for an invasion south. And of course, it's directly in front of Turkey. We're going to change tack now a little bit and take a look at some of the allied relationships in Ezekiel 38 and Daniel 11. Where are they at now and what are they doing? Well, we'll start briefly with the relationship between Israel and the US. And so you'll remember last year, I think, or the year before, that Trump was the first to establish an embassy in Israel officially, and also recognised Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Well, this year in March, as recently as this month, Trump did what no previous US president has ever done, and he recognised the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. And he also set the scene for legitimising Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria, which is highly contentious. And by doing so, Trump has once again alienated the US from the rest of the world on these particular foreign policies. And in some cases, obviously, he's directly challenging the foreign policies of a lot of those the nations in the Gogin coalition in Ezekiel 38. We've also seen growing ties between Russia and the African states. And we saw earlier, Ezekiel 38 talks about the alliance between African nations such as Libya and Ethiopia, modern-day Sudan and Ethiopia, and Russia. And this year we really saw Russian influence projected towards Africa. And interestingly, what we saw here is that Putin isn't looking to make new friendships per se. He's focusing on building strategic allies. So not allies just to get votes in the United Nations, but he's focused on investing heavily in strategic assets throughout Africa and security assets. And so at the beginning of the year, the president of Zimbabwe visited Putin in his summer resort in Sochi, and they discussed the expansion of Russia's involvement and investments in Zimbabwe. And they signed off on some business deals and some contracts and trade deals. And this really set the tone for the rest of the year as Putin circled his way through different African leaders. And I mentioned earlier that we know from Ezekiel 38 that there will be direct military cooperation between Sudan and Russia. And back in January this year, it was published that the Sudanese parliament said a draft military agreement signed between Sudan and Russia would pave the road for the latter to build a military base on the Red Sea coast in the future. And so Sudan's president has offered to construct an airbase for Russia on the Red Sea coast and to equip them, the Sudanese army, with Russian weapons, including Russian fighter jets and surface-to-air missiles. That's pretty significant. In June, the Guardian newspaper, amongst others, published an article which said that Russia is seeking to bolster its presence in at least 13 countries across Africa by building relationships with existing rulers, striking military deals, grooming a new generation of leaders, and undercover agents, leaked documents reveal. And interestingly, they published those leaked documents, those Russian documents, and they detailed the scale at which Russia is building strategic influence in Africa. And so here are some of the strategic projects that Russia is working on. And you can see nuclear projects in Sudan, Rwanda, and Zambia. You can see oil projects in Nigeria, Ghana, and Mozambique. You can see diamond projects in Botswana and Zimbabwe. And you can see Algeria, Egypt, Angola, and Sudan buying up Russian weaponry. And these are significant projects that have already begun, let alone the lineup of strategic military assets, strategic military initiatives that are yet to take shape and have not yet are not mentioned on that map. And so the scale at which this is happening has had the US so concerned that in December 2018, the US National Security Advisor, the US National Security Advisor, John Bolton, announced a new strategy entirely dedicated to combating Russia's influence in Africa. So we can see very powerfully both growing tensions and growing alliances described in the prophecies of the Russian invasion. Now we're just going to pivot again and take a look at some of the converging national interests that we're seeing, because these nations are really starting to cross each other's paths on a scale and a level that's not been seen before in history. And this is particularly so when it comes to the relationship between Israel and Russia, and Israel and Europe. And so the first the converging interest we're going to look at is the relationship between Israel and Russia. And we're going to start at the beginning of this year when, during the Munich Security Conference, the Chancellor of Germany, Angela Merkel, gave a very telling warning. During a press conference where the US was discussing the situation in the Middle East, she said, "Is it a good idea for the Americans to suddenly and quickly withdraw from Syria, or at once more strengthen the capacity of Iran and Russia to exert their influence?" What ominous words they were. You might remember the headlines only a few weeks ago when Trump did exactly what Merkel had warned him not to do, and how right she was. In late October, Trump pulled US troops out of Syria at a moment's notice as Turkey threatened to intervene in Syria and destroy the Kurds. And the US had troops in Syria protecting the Kurds. And when Turkey started to move across the border into Syria, the US army left their bases, they destroyed their assets, they literally blew them up, burnt them, and they crossed the border into Iraq. And within hours, the Russian and Syrian army came rolling into the Euphratian region. And like that, Russia had regained almost complete control of Syria overnight. And when this happened, the Times of Israel published an article describing how Israel's political capital was living in fear over what had just happened. It said many officials in Jerusalem are deeply worried about being abandoned by their superpower ally, as the American decision to gradually disengage from this part of the world, which started under former US President Barack Obama, threatens to embolden Israel's enemies, Iran and its allies and proxies in Lebanon, Syria, Gaza and elsewhere. And the Wall Street Journal ran an article saying that Putin is the new king of Syria. By giving Turkey a green light to invade northern Syria, the US upended the balance of power in the Middle East. And with a single stroke, Russia is the biggest winner. And Netanyahu responded, I think the same day or a day later, by saying in a press conference that Israel will defend itself by itself. And so far, Netanyahu has been acting boldly in Syria under the protective umbrella of the US. In April this year, Israel bombed an Iranian missile production facility in Syria, killing 17 Iranians. And in fact, throughout this year, there have been multiple Israeli operations in Syria, continuously destroying and degrading Iranian assets. Another operation only just happened a week or two ago. It was actually one of the biggest in recent history. It just wasn't reported as such. And this has always been done with the US close by. Now that the US are leaving Syria, Netanyahu seems to be no less resolute in Israel defending itself by itself. However, as we know, it can't go on forever. Israel's incursions in Syria are increasingly making a mockery of Russia and of Russia's overarching military protection of Syria. So how long will Putin allow this to continue? It can't be long. And so at a military level, we're witnessing Israel and Russia edge closer together towards conflict. And I just want to pause for a moment and highlight something here. Many of us would be familiar with the three elements of a crime scene: means, motive, and opportunity. And it's possible that we can look at national conflicts in the same way. Take, for example, Russia. Do they have the means by which they could conduct an overwhelming military operation in the Middle East? Well, yes, we've seen that already. Do they have the opportunity? Well, with the US withdrawing from the Middle East, yes, they do. But here's the interesting part. Do they have the motive? Does Russia really want to invade the Middle East, and in particular Israel? Because if you look at the situation now, Putin is a self-professed friend of Israel. He grew up in Jewish hands. He's done a lot of work in Russia to stem anti-Semitism. He's pushed back on anti-Semitism within his own political parties, and has moderated calls from other Russian politicians to destroy Israel. So does Russia really have the motive? Does Putin have the motive as it stands? Well, the answer, perhaps, is in Europe. For the last 20 years, it has been Putin's ambition to make Europe dependent on Russian energy. Why? So that Russia has political leverage over Germany. It's a power play. And so this year, a significant part of that plan went into effect when the first third of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was laid. And this pipeline supplies gas directly from Russia to Germany. It's a pipeline that the European Union don't like because they recognise that it increases Russia's influence over Germany, which is the heart of the European Union. And some of you will be aware of Putin's inclination towards the use of energy as a vertical of geopolitical influence. When he was younger, he completed a doctorate. Technically speaking, before his presidency, his title was Dr. Putin. And the subject of the thesis that he studied and published was the exploitation of natural resources for the benefit of the Russian economy. He actually studied a doctorate on that topic. And so he understands better than most people the strategic importance of this project, the Nord Stream 2 project, for expanding Russian influence. However, there's a problem, a significant problem for Putin, a real problem that puts his project in jeopardy. And that problem is Israel. The problem is that Israel is commissioning one of the biggest gas platforms in the world, the Leviathan project. You can see the platform there that was commissioned a few months ago, only a few weeks ago, I think, in Israeli waters. And it's a project that Israel are very proud of. But the problem is that this project, along with Israel's other gas assets, is really starting to frustrate Putin to no end. And that's not me saying this. This is, I'll read this quote directly from Forbes, which says, Russian President Vladimir Putin's dissatisfaction with Israel's Leviathan project can be explained in the context of its challenge to Russia's domestic gas giant Gazprom and its dominant position in the European gas market. This is evidenced by Putin's veiled threats against Prime Minister Netanyahu. According to a senior Israeli official who spoke with me on condition of anonymity, Israel rebutted an attempt by Russia to muscle its way into the Leviathan project by involving Gazprom, which is currently under US sanctions. Putin promised Netanyahu that he would restrain both Syria and Hezbollah from interfering in the project if the state gas company was guaranteed access. If not, however, he could not make such a guarantee. And the implied threat is clear. So how much clearer does that need to be? Putin is essentially saying, you let us look after your project, or we'll let Syria or Hezbollah look after it for you. One way or another, it's going to end up in Russian hands. And so, in answer to my earlier question, does Russia have the motive to invade Israel? Well, I think we're starting to see that happen. Because taking Israel means that Russia has leverage over, has more strategic influence over Europe, and particularly Germany. Now, that implied threat from Putin was delivered to Israel in February this year. 5 months later, in August, Israel finalised a deal with Europe to supply them 2.3 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So Israel is really carving out itself as a threat to Putin's ability to influence Europe. Israel is diminishing Russia's ability to influence Europe, which is an integral part of Putin's pride and lifelong mission. And as it turns out, the problem isn't going away. 3 months after Israel signed a deal with Europe, another huge gas discovery was found, rubbing salt into that frustration that Putin already had. And so as Israel discovers more gas resources, Netanyahu boasts more and more about Israel's growing power and influence in the region. Which, by the way, is a state that we find Israel in when Russia invades in Ezekiel 38, in a state of confidence and power. And as Israel's pride grows, so does their position as a key Russian target for the exploitation of natural resources for the benefit of the Russian economy. And so the situation gets more and more intriguing as we find only a few weeks ago that Israel and Egypt are actually working together to supply Europe with gas. So now, as you're aware, this is very significant in the context of everything else that's going on. Why? Because Daniel 11 specifically mentions that Egypt will be targeted by Russia. And now we have a clear reason why Russia would exploit both Israel and Egypt. Because on one hand, Israel is producing the gas while Egypt is processing it before sending it to Europe. And Russia would need ownership of both the production and the processing infrastructure as they work hand in hand. And so the fact that we live in an age where Israel and Egypt are working together on economic projects is one thing. But Israel and Egypt becoming a supplier of gas to Europe is another thing entirely. And it's just incredible to see how these things have been lining up in 2019. Only a few years ago, this would have been inconceivable. And so we've seen now that Russia has the means, the motive, and the opportunity to invade Israel. If not now, then in the coming years. But do we see any signs of Russia really starting to test that? Do we see signs of Russia starting to test Israel's sovereignty? We're going to take a very quick look at 3 examples of how Russia is testing Israel's sovereignty. And these examples that I'm going to show you aren't from the beginning of this year or the last few months. They're actually taken from the last few weeks, only about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And so they're very, very recent. The first example was when Israel shot one of the world's most advanced missiles into Syria when it was retaliating to a Syrian projectile over the Golan Heights that was coming over to Israel. So Israel sent across 2 of its advanced Stunner missiles to intercept the Syrian one. And when their missile defence system determined that the Syrian missile wouldn't hit anything in Israeli territory, the Israelis deactivated the explosive capability of their own missiles, and they tried to self-detonate them while they were flying into Syria, towards their target. And it's important that Israel do this, because if they don't, then a set of very advanced missiles can potentially be recovered and sent back to Russia, where they can be reverse engineered. The problem is, on this occasion, is that the Israelis were unable to self-detonate their own missiles. According to the intelligence reports, they tried, but they couldn't. And they found afterwards that Russia was jamming the missiles, that one missile, so that Israel couldn't talk to it anymore while it was in flight. The Russians were then able to get access to that missile without it being damaged significantly, and are likely to have taken it back to Moscow. Now, this might seem like run-of-the-mill tactics. However, it's actually the military people in Israel believe it's a huge strategic blow to their air defensive capabilities. Because if Russia can learn what secrets Israel have tied up in their missile technology, then those secrets could be well shared with Iran. And so that's obviously their thinking. But of course, if Russia has it, that's potentially worse. And so this only happened a couple of weeks ago. And the Israeli defence leadership are on edge as a result of it. So the second event happened again, just very recently, when a Russian submarine was spotted in Israeli waters by IDF naval forces, who prompted the submarine to leave the area and head back towards the Western Mediterranean. The only realistic conclusion for a Russian submarine being found in Israeli waters without permission is for an intelligence gathering mission of some kind. And so if true, this has profound implications on Israeli security. The third event, again, happened a few weeks ago, and it was when GPS systems in Israel for aircraft stopped working or started showing incorrect data. And a US researcher was able to identify that GPS jamming was occurring, which originated from within a Russian base in Syria. And so there's 3 very, very quick and recent examples showing clearly that Russia is actively probing Israel's military defensive systems in a concerted multi-dimensional effort. Now, it's not an escalation of tension per se, but what we can see is that Russia is overtly chipping away at Israel's military power. So let's now move on to Israel and Europe. So in Ezekiel 38, we see European nations supporting the Russian invasion against Israel. And we're going to see over the next few slides how Europe has become increasingly anti-Israel this year. So only a few weeks ago, the European Court of Justice issued what amounted to a boycott of products made by Israel in Judea and Samaria. So Judea and Samaria, the area in red on the map, is known by much of the world today as the West Bank. It was captured by Israel in 1967, and Israel have since been allowing a Palestinian state to inhabit that territory. However, there is growing conflict in the area as Israeli settlers are increasingly farming and building up in Judea and Samaria. And since the 1960s, the European Union and the United Nations have insisted that Israel does not and should not inhabit this territory, and that Israel should hand it back to the Palestinians. Well, Israel isn't giving their land away, and this is really beginning to annoy Europe and the United Nations. And so this constant argument over Israeli sovereignty in the West Bank came to a head when the European Union created a new European directive that any products that are made within Judea and Samaria by Israeli settlers, should now be marked or branded as products that are made in illegal settlements. Now, this is a big issue for Israel because there are thousands of vineyards in Judea and Samaria that export wines all over the world, especially to Europe. And until now, those wines have been labelled as made in Israel. But now, following the ruling, Europe won't allow those products to be sold in Europe unless they're branded as being made in illegal settlements. And there's no doubt that this is just an excuse to try and target and damage Israel. The European Union has a well-known adversity towards Israel. When it happened, Israeli leaders were quick to point out that the European Union has no problems accepting products that are made within a number of countries that have been annexed or occupied by other nations. As an example, the Western Sahara, Chinese-ruled Tibet, Indian-controlled Kashmir, and northern Cyprus, which is occupied by Turkey. The EU don't question the import of goods from those countries, from those places. They only question those coming from the West Bank in Israel. And interestingly, in order for this law to pass, the EU legally needed the unanimous vote from all their member states. One state, that is Hungary, actually vetoed the vote, and when that happened, the vote isn't supposed to pass. However, the European Union ignored the veto from Hungary and enacted the new laws, so desperate were they to attack Israel politically. And of course, the United Nations were quick to jump onto the bandwagon to support the European law, despite the fact that it was discriminatory and it was technically not passed properly into European law. And so European criticism of Israel has continued and to grow throughout this year over a multitude of issues, and we can see two examples there now. So there's been constant issues over settlement activity in the West Bank. And not only has this been happening at a geopolitical level, but at a national socio-cultural level. So prior to World War II, we saw massive socio-cultural changes within Europe and within the Soviet Union, which drove such fierce conflicts. In Germany, the nation was increasingly gripped with anti-Semitism, expressed openly and politically as Hitler rose in power. And we're beginning to see again in some places in Europe, some countries where anti-Semitism is growing exponentially. Well, for the most part across Europe it's doing that, but it's really starting to express itself politically in some countries in Europe. The picture on the right shows the French president walking through a graveyard, appalled as he quietly observes Jewish graves that have been desecrated with Nazi symbols earlier this year. And this act is symbolic of a mood change that's happening across the European populace. And while most current European leaders don't tolerate anti-Semitism, if the anti-Semitic sentiment continues to grow throughout the people of Europe, then it will soon be expressed politically in Europe, much like the start of World War II. At which point, invading Israel might not seem such an extreme thing for the French and others to do. And while French culture is becoming more anti-Semitic, the nation itself is becoming more and more entrenched militarily in the Middle East. You might remember the 2016 terrorist attacks which rocked France. At the time, they sent France into a state of emergency. The army came in, and every street corner had French troopers armed with heavy weapons to protect the people against any further attacks. Well, that terrorist attack rocked France so badly that they remained in a state of emergency for a few years. And that whole situation led to an intense focus on national security. And the only way they could really get to the root cause of the problem of terrorism in France was by hitting ISIS in Syria. And so you might remember at the time, President Macron reacted by immediately sending warplanes and missiles into Syria. And ever since, the French people have been more involved in Syria and more open to working alongside Russia than what other nations have. Now, none of that is news to us, potentially. However, what is interesting is that when Trump decided to pull troops out of Syria, this was looked upon grievously by the French. Macron complained about the fact that Trump didn't even consult NATO. What is the point of NATO if support is ineffective in the Middle East, where the French national interest lies? And you can imagine if Trump completely evacuates the Middle East, it would be entirely realistic for a coalition between France and Russia to step in. Now, France is in a challenging position. US support under Trump is proving ineffective in Syria, and Trump's support of NATO is dying. And you might remember that when Trump was on the campaign trail, he called out NATO as being useless and ineffective. And at the time, that was pretty explosive news coming from the mouth of a US president. Well, now we have a European leader essentially agreeing that NATO is essentially brain dead, which is really unprecedented. And interestingly, Angela Merkel, leader of Germany, immediately reacted by disagreeing. And of course, Russia immediately reacted by welcoming Macron's words as truthful. So now the Europeans are increasingly focusing on replacing NATO with the European military. And while the leader of Germany doesn't want to replace NATO yet, many of the other European nations are increasingly signing up to the dream of one European military. And spearheading that charge is the French president. So when we look back over the last year, some very clear themes have emerged. We've seen Russia expanding influence. We've seen Russia expanding influence and growing ties in Africa significantly. We've seen Europe becoming more dependent on Russia. We've seen Russia growing in influence in the Middle East. We've seen Israel challenging Russia's growing energy and military influence. We've seen Israel's confidence growing. We've seen the Saudi-Iranian conflict escalate. We've seen growing anti-Semitism throughout Europe. And all of these things align with what we expect to happen from Ezekiel 38. Now, a critic might look at that list and say, well, you have to be cherry-picking a whole lot of events and putting them together to look like Ezekiel 38 is about to happen. That's what you're doing. But let's be clear. 15 years ago, some of these things never even existed. Russia's influence diminished post-Cold War. Russian-African ties were ad hoc. Europe didn't really depend on Russia. Russia didn't even have an active military presence in the Middle East. Israel didn't even have any oil or gas resources. and was not a threat to the Russian market or to Putin's influence or power. But we can go back even further to Brother Thomas's time, where we found the Russians were struggling to contain a civil revolution, let alone have an active military presence elsewhere in the world. Of course, Israel didn't even exist at that time. And so if we put that into perspective, we can confidently say that never in the history of the world has the world been as aligned as what it was in 2019 with what we expect from Ezekiel 38. And so reflecting on the events over the course of 2019, we've seen a truly historic year. And as we reflect in our own lives over the past year, while all of these things were happening around us, how much were we looking for the return of Christ? You know, we started our consideration this evening by looking at the circumstances in which past brethren and sisters lived as they watched current events unfold around them. Revelation says that they were crying out to God, "How long, O Lord?" And as they were crying out, they were looking to our time today for the moment when Christ would return. Can we honestly look back at our year and say that we had a persistent desire over the course of a year to watch for the coming of Christ, to read God's word every day, to follow Christ in his absence? Can we look back over the course of a year and see ourselves having placed God at the centre of our lives and our families? And as we saw tonight, the world has never been as close as to the return of Christ as what it is now. And so now is the time to be making changes in our lives to follow Christ with integrity and desire. And so as we reflect on the signs that we've seen over the past year, let's continue to watch and pray for the soon return of Christ and the establishment of his kingdom on earth.